She thought filing for divorce overnight would catch me off guard, but what she didn't know was I'd been awake long before that email ever arrived. It came in at 4:17 a.m., the soft ping of my phone cutting through the kind of silence you only notice when something in your life is already shifting. I didn't rush to open it. I didn't feel panic, or anger, or even confusion. Just a stillness. The subject line read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage. Melissa Carter, my wife of 11 years. Filed at 3:52 a.m. While most people were asleep, she had already decided the outcome of our life. Or at least, she thought she had. I sat up slowly, the glow of the screen lighting up the room in that pale blue tone that makes everything feel colder than it is. No calls. No warning. No conversation. Just paperwork. Clean. Efficient. Final. I read through it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see how far she was willing to go. Full asset disclosure requests. Immediate account freezes. Claims that suggested urgency, instability, even risk. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a move. A calculated one. I placed the phone down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a few seconds, letting the quiet settle back in. People imagine moments like this come with raised voices or slammed doors. They don't. Sometimes they come like this. Quiet. Precise. Almost professional. I got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. The house felt exactly the same, but I knew it wasn't. Something had already been rewritten. I leaned against the counter, scrolling through the document one more time, slower now. Language matters in legal filings. Words are chosen carefully. And Melissa had chosen hers like someone who had help. That was the first thing that confirmed what I had already suspected for months. This didn't start tonight. This started long before I saw that email. I walked back to my office, turned on the desk lamp, and opened my laptop. There's a folder on my desktop most people wouldn't notice. No label that stands out. Just another file among dozens. But inside it was something I had built quietly, piece by piece over time. Not out of paranoia. Out of pattern recognition. Small things at first. Questions about accounts she'd never asked about before. Casual mentions of assets she used to ignore. A shift in tone when money came up, like she wasn't asking out of curiosity anymore, but verification. At the time, I didn't confront it. I observed it. Because confrontation ends a story. Observation lets it unfold. I clicked open the folder. Contingency plan. Everything was there. Dates. Records. Copies. Things I hoped I'd never need, but prepared anyway. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I just followed the steps I had already decided on long before this morning ever arrived. By 6:08 a.m., before the sun had fully come up, I had filed something of my own. Not a response. Not a reaction. A fraud claim. Filed clean. Filed early. Filed with precision. While she was still asleep in the other room, thinking she had just taken control of everything, the narrative had already shifted. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked out the window as the first light started breaking across the street. Calm. Quiet. Controlled. That's the thing about timing. It doesn't belong to the person who moves first. It belongs to the person who was ready before the move was ever made. By the time Melissa walked into the kitchen, the sun had already climbed halfway over the neighboring rooftops, casting that soft morning light across the hardwood floors like nothing had changed, like the world was still following the same rules it did yesterday. She moved the way she always did in the mornings, precise, composed, pouring coffee into her favorite white mug, the one she bought during a trip to Napa 3 years ago. If someone had walked in right then, they would have seen a normal couple starting a normal day. They would not have seen the email sitting in my inbox or the claim already filed under my name. She glanced at me briefly, just enough to acknowledge I was there, then looked away, like I was already becoming part of her past. That was new. Not the distance, that had been growing for a while, but the certainty. It was in the way she held herself, the way her shoulders stayed squared. Like she had already rehearsed this moment in her head and knew exactly how it was supposed to play out. I took a sip of my coffee and said nothing. Silence can say more than any argument ever could, and I had no intention of wasting words when the real conversation was going to happen somewhere else, somewhere with records and timestamps and consequences. She set her mug down and finally spoke, her tone even, controlled, almost careful. She said we needed to talk, like the word needed had not already expired a few hours earlier. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood what she thought this was. She believed she was initiating something. She believed she was still in control of the narrative. I let her speak. She talked about distance, about growing apart, about how things had not felt right for a long time. The usual structure people use when they want to make something calculated sound emotional. I listened without interrupting, not because I was patient, but because I was confirming something. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. This was not a decision she made overnight. This was something she had been building toward, step by step, quietly, just like I had been building something of my own. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for resistance or confusion or maybe even anger. What she got instead was a simple question. I asked her when she had first spoken to the attorney. Just that. No accusation, no raised voice, just a question placed exactly where it needed to be. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. A pause that did not belong to someone who had everything under control. She answered quickly, too quickly, saying it did not matter, that the decision had already been made. But it did matter. Timing always matters. Because timing tells you whether something is a reaction or a plan. And this was not a reaction. I stood up, walked to the sink, and rinsed out my cup slowly, giving her just enough time to sit with the silence that followed. Then I said something else, calm, steady, measured. I told her she should check her email. I did not explain. I did not elaborate. I just let the sentence sit there between us. She frowned slightly, confusion replacing certainty for the first time that morning, and reached for her phone. I watched her eyes move across the screen, watched the moment her confidence started to fracture, not dramatically, not in some visible collapse, but in the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her posture shifted just enough to break the image she had been holding onto. She read it once, then again, just like I had. The difference was, I had expected what I saw. She had not. She looked up at me, searching for something in my face, maybe an explanation, maybe an opening, but there was nothing there for her to find. I did not give her anger. I did not give her satisfaction. I gave her the truth in its simplest form. I told her that what she filed last night was not the beginning of a divorce. It was the beginning of an investigation. And for the first time since she walked into that kitchen, she had nothing to say. She did not argue right away, and that told me more than any reaction could have. People who believe they are still in control usually push back immediately, but Melissa just stood there, phone still in her hand, eyes scanning the same lines over and over like the meaning might change if she looked at it long enough. It did not. Legal language does not bend for emotion. It sits there, fixed, precise, and indifferent. I turned slightly, leaning against the counter again, giving her space not out of courtesy, but because pressure reveals more than confrontation ever will. She finally set the phone down, slower this time, like the weight of it had changed. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for, not loud, not aggressive, just controlled enough to sound intentional. She asked what this was? Not why, not how, just what. That is the kind of question people ask when they realize they are missing information, not when they are confused. I told her exactly what it was, nothing more, nothing less. I said it was a formal claim supported by documented discrepancies tied to shared financial activity, and that once filed, it triggered a review process that neither of us could stop. I did not explain the details yet. Details come later. Timing matters. She watched me carefully, like she was trying to measure how much I knew, how far I had already gone, whether this was a bluff or something deeper. The problem for her was simple. I do not bluff. Not with things that leave records. Not with things that carry consequences. She took a step back, folding her arms, a subtle shift into defense, the kind people fall into when they realize the ground under them is not as stable as they thought. Then she said something that almost sounded like confidence, but it came a second too late. She said there was nothing fraudulent, that everything had been transparent, that I was overreacting. I nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the statement like it was part of a script I had already read before. Then I asked her about a transfer from 6 weeks ago, a number precise down to the dollar, an account she assumed I had not noticed. The pause that followed was longer this time. Not dramatic, not obvious, but long enough. She responded with an explanation that sounded prepared, but not complete. It had structure, but no depth. That is the difference between something rehearsed and something real. Real answers carry detail without effort. Rehearsed ones rely on timing and tone. I let her finish without interruption, then simply said that the explanation did not match the record. Again, no emotion, no escalation, just fact placed where it needed to be. The room felt quieter after that, not because there was no sound, but because the certainty she walked in with had started to dissolve. That is how shifts happen. Not in explosions, but in small fractures that spread until the whole structure changes. I moved past her toward the hallway, not to leave, but to change the angle of the conversation. Position matters. Distance changes perception. From there, I told her something she did not expect to hear. I said this was never about catching her off guard. It was about understanding how far she was willing to go once she believed no one was watching. That made her look up again, sharper this time, searching for meaning behind the words. People get uncomfortable when they realize their actions might have been observed differently than they intended. I continued, still calm, still steady, explaining that patterns matter more than single events, and that over the past several months, certain patterns had become impossible to ignore. Questions about asset structures. Interest in accounts that had never concerned her before. Timing of conversations that lined up too neatly with external consultations. None of it was proof on its own, but together, it formed something else. Something consistent. Something deliberate. I did not accuse her of anything directly. I did not need to. The implication was already there, built piece by piece in a way that did not require raising my voice. She tried to interrupt once, then stopped herself, like she realized interrupting would only make her sound less certain. That was new. Melissa had always been articulate, always controlled, but control depends on clarity, and clarity was no longer something she had full access to. I told her that the review process would proceed whether she agreed with it or not, and that every record, every transaction, every access point tied to our shared financial life would be examined in detail. I watched that information settle in, watched the shift from confidence to calculation, the moment someone starts rethinking not just what they said, but what they did. Then I said one more thing, quiet enough that it almost blended into the silence. I said that the difference between a plan and a mistake is whether someone else was prepared for it. And in this case, I had been prepared long before this morning ever arrived. Melissa did not follow me right away, and that hesitation told me something had finally settled in. Not acceptance, not even understanding, but awareness. The kind that makes people slow down because they realize moving too fast might make things worse. I stopped near the doorway to my office, not turning back, just enough distance between us to shift the dynamic completely. Conversations change when they are no longer face to face. They become less about emotion and more about structure. She stayed in the kitchen for a few seconds, then I heard her footsteps, measured, controlled, but not as confident as before. When she reached the doorway, she did not step inside immediately. That was another change. This room had always been mine, but it had never been off limits. Now it felt different to her, and that difference mattered. I walked to the desk and opened the laptop again, not to prove anything, but to continue something that had already been set in motion. I did not rush. I let the screen load, let the files sit there in plain view without drawing attention to them. People reveal more when they are trying to understand something on their own. She asked what I meant by patterns, her voice steadier now, like she was trying to regain footing by focusing on specifics. That was expected. When broad control slips, people move to details. I nodded slightly and began explaining, not like an accusation, but like a report. I told her that over the last 8 months, there had been a shift in how she interacted with anything tied to financial structure. Not sudden, not obvious, but consistent. Questions that used to be casual became precise. Conversations that used to end quickly started to linger just a little longer. Timing that used to feel natural started to align with external events I later verified. I kept my tone even neutral, like I was describing something that existed independently of both of us. Because in a way it did. She listened without interrupting this time, which told me she was no longer trying to control the conversation. She was trying to understand it. I pulled up a simple timeline, nothing complicated, just dates and notes, enough to show progression without overwhelming the point. I did not point at it. I did not highlight anything. I just let it sit there as I spoke. I explained how patterns are not about one action, but repetition with direction. Anyone can ask a question once. Anyone can move money once. But when those actions begin to follow a path, when they start connecting in ways that suggest intention, that is when they stop being isolated. That is when they become something else. She stepped a little closer, just enough to see the screen clearly now, and I could feel the shift again, smaller this time, but deeper. This was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about how much of it I had seen. She asked me how long I had been keeping track, and there was something different in that question. Not defensive, not dismissive, just careful. I told her the truth. I said I did not start tracking anything until I noticed the third inconsistency. That is usually where patterns begin to form. Before that, it is just noise. After that, it becomes data. She looked at me for a moment, like she was trying to measure whether that answer made things better or worse. It did neither. It just clarified the timeline. I closed the laptop halfway, not fully, leaving the screen dim but still visible. That small action changed the focus back to conversation instead of evidence. Then I said something she had not expected. I told her this was not about proving something to her. It was about documenting something for a process that was already in motion. There is a difference. One seeks agreement. The other seeks verification. She exhaled slowly, the first real sign of tension breaking through her control, and asked what happens next. That question matters more than any denial. It means the person has moved from resisting the situation to trying to navigate it. I told her the process would begin with a full review of all shared financial activity, including access points, authorizations, and transfers, and that it would be handled by people who do not rely on explanations, only records. I kept it simple, direct, without exaggeration. Clarity carries more weight than intensity. She nodded once, almost automatically, like she was absorbing information faster than she could respond to it. Then she asked if this could be stopped. That was the first time uncertainty fully replaced control in her voice. I shook my head slightly and said no, not now. Once something is filed at that level, it does not respond to personal requests. It follows procedure. I watched that settle in, watched the realization take shape that this was no longer contained within our house, our conversation, or even our relationship. It had moved beyond that. I stepped past her then, heading back toward the kitchen, not to leave, but to reset the space again. Movement matters. It reminds people that control is not tied to one place. As I passed, I said one final thing, not loud, not sharp, just clear. I said the difference between what she did and what I did was simple. She acted when she thought the moment was right. I prepared long before the moment ever arrived. And in situations like this, preparation always outlasts timing. The house felt different after that, not louder, not colder, just defined. Like every object had taken a position without saying a word. Melissa stayed near the office doorway for a few seconds after I walked past her, and I could feel it without turning around. People do not always follow movement right away when they are trying to process what just happened. They pause, not because they are unsure where to go, but because they are recalculating how to move next. I went back to the kitchen, rinsed the glass I had left earlier, and set it down carefully, the sound of it touching the counter sharper than it should have been. Small sounds carry more weight when everything else is quiet. A few moments later, she walked in again, slower this time, like the space itself required more attention than before. She did not reach for her coffee. She did not check her phone. She just stood there, looking at me like she was trying to find something she could still control. That was the shift. Control had moved from assumption to negotiation. She asked me if I had spoken to anyone else about this, and the way she asked it mattered. Not accusatory, not defensive, just careful. I told her yes, because honesty in moments like this is not a weakness, it is leverage. I explained that once something reaches a certain level, it is no longer handled privately. Documentation requires oversight, and oversight brings structure. She nodded slowly, absorbing that, and I could see the next layer of realization forming. This was no longer something she could manage through conversation or timing. It had entered a system. Systems do not respond to emotion. They respond to data. She moved to the counter, resting her hands lightly against it, like she needed something solid to anchor the moment. Then she asked what exactly had triggered the claim. Not in general terms, but specifically. That was important. Specific questions mean the person is trying to map cause and effect, trying to understand which action led to which consequence. I took a breath, not because I needed to, but because pacing matters, and told her that it was not one action. It was a sequence. I explained that the transfer I mentioned earlier was not the problem on its own. It was the context around it. The timing, the access point, the way it connected to two other activities that, individually, looked routine, but together formed something else. Something intentional. I did not raise my voice. I did not add emphasis. I just let the information exist between us. She listened closely now, not interrupting, not deflecting, just taking it in piece by piece. That is what happens when people realize they are no longer ahead of the situation. They start focusing on understanding instead of controlling. She asked if this meant she was being accused of something formal, and there was a slight tension in her voice again, not panic, but awareness of consequence. I told her that the claim initiated a review, and that the outcome of that review would determine everything else. I kept it neutral, because neutrality carries authority in situations like this. It does not invite argument. It closes it. She looked down for a moment, then back up, and asked if I had been planning this. That question was different. It was not about the process anymore. It was about me. About intent. I met her eyes and answered simply. I said I had been preparing, not planning. Planning suggests a desired outcome. Preparation ensures readiness regardless of outcome. That distinction matters. She held my gaze for a second longer than before, like she was trying to decide whether to challenge that or accept it, then looked away. Another small shift. The conversation was no longer something she could steer. It was something she had to move through. I walked toward the window, looking out at the street where everything continued as if nothing had changed, cars passing, people going about their morning routines, unaware that inside this house, a completely different structure had just been set in motion. Then I said something that was not meant to provoke, just to clarify. I told her that whatever she believed this was going to be when she filed those papers, it had already become something else. Not because of what I did this morning, but because of everything that had led up to it. Actions do not exist in isolation. They build. And when they reach a certain point, they create consequences that no one can rewrite in real time. I turned back toward her, calm, steady, and added one final detail she needed to understand. I told her that from this point forward, every decision she made would not just be part of a personal situation, but part of a recorded process. Every word, every action, every attempt to adjust the narrative would be evaluated against what already existed. And in systems like that, consistency matters more than intention. She did not respond right away. She just stood there, processing, recalculating, the weight of it settling in piece by piece. And for the first time since this started, the silence between us was not empty. It was full of realization. She did not move for a while after that, and the stillness in the room started to feel different, heavier, like the weight of everything had finally settled into place. I could see it in the way she stood, no longer trying to control the space, no longer trying to guide the conversation, just existing inside something she had not fully anticipated. That is the moment people begin to rethink not just what they are going to say next, but everything that led up to where they are standing. I walked over to the table and picked up my phone, not to check anything, but to let the motion signal that the conversation was no longer the only thing in play. Action outside of words matters. It reminds people that the situation continues even when the room goes quiet. She watched that movement closely, and I could tell she was trying to understand what had already been set in motion. Beyond what she could see. She asked if there was a way to clarify things before they went further, and that question carried a different tone now. It was no longer about control. It was about limitation. I set the phone down again and answered honestly. I said clarification happens through documentation, not conversation. What is said in a room can be adjusted. What is recorded cannot. That is the difference between intention and evidence. She nodded slowly, and I could see the realization deepen. This was not something that could be managed by explaining or reframing. It had moved beyond that point. She took a breath, steadier this time, and asked what exactly had been documented. That was the first time she asked a question that pointed directly at the core of the issue. Not the process, not the timing, but the substance. I leaned slightly against the table and explained that documentation is never built from one moment. It is built from consistency. Access logs, transaction histories, authorization trails, timestamps that align in ways that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. I kept my tone neutral, not emphasizing any one part, because the strength of it was in how everything connected. She listened carefully, and I could see her mind moving through possibilities, trying to identify where those connections might have formed. That is what people do when they realize the structure is already built. They look for the point where it started. I told her that the system does not look for explanations first. It looks for alignment. If the data aligns, the explanation has to match it, not the other way around. That is where most people misunderstand how these processes work. They think if they can explain something well enough, it changes the outcome. It does not. Explanation follows evidence, not the reverse. She stepped back slightly, her posture shifting again, not defensive this time, but cautious. That was new. Caution means the person understands that each move matters now. She asked if this would involve outside review, and I told her yes. Not in a dramatic way, just plainly. Once something crosses a certain threshold, it is handled by people who have no connection to either of us. That is what makes it objective. That is also what makes it final. She looked down at the counter, her fingers resting lightly against the surface, like she was grounding herself in something familiar. Then she asked a question that carried more weight than any before it. She asked if I had expected this outcome. Not the situation, but the direction it was taking. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer needed to be exact. I told her I did not expect anything. I prepared for possibilities. Expectation creates bias. Preparation removes it. That is why I did not react this morning. Reaction is tied to surprise. Preparation is tied to readiness. She looked up at me again, and this time there was no attempt to challenge what I was saying. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the structure she believed she had control over was no longer hers to manage. I walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to let the moment settle, then said one more thing before stepping out of the room. I told her that from this point forward, the outcome would not be determined by what either of us wanted, but by what could be verified. And in situations like this, verification always moves slower than intention, but it always moves further. Then I continued down the hallway, leaving her standing there with the realization that whatever she thought she had started had already moved beyond her reach. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt different, sharper, like everything had been recalibrated without anyone noticing. The street looked the same, cars passing, a neighbor walking his dog, the rhythm of a normal morning continuing without interruption, but for me, the timeline had already shifted. I got into my car, started the engine, and let it idle for a moment, not because I needed time to think, but because I understood the importance of pacing. When something moves into a formal process, rushing becomes a liability. Precision matters more than speed. I pulled out slowly and drove toward my office, the same route I had taken hundreds of times before, but this time every detail felt more defined. Not emotional, just clear. Clarity is what replaces uncertainty when preparation meets reality. By the time I arrived, the building was just starting to come alive, lights flickering on floor by floor, people stepping out of elevators with coffee in hand, unaware that for me, the day had started hours earlier. I walked in, nodded to the front desk, and went straight to my office without stopping. No small talk, no distractions. The moment had already been set, and everything from this point forward needed to align with it. I closed the door behind me, set my phone on the desk, and opened my laptop again. There was a message waiting, exactly where I expected it to be. A confirmation receipt, timestamped, clean, official. The claim had been accepted for review. That was the point where it stopped being a filing and became a process. I read through it once, not because I needed to understand it, but because I respected the structure of it. Systems like this are built on sequence, and sequence is what gives them authority. A few seconds later, another notification appeared, this one from a contact I had already looped in before this morning ever began. Not a lawyer in the dramatic sense people imagine, not someone who speaks loudly or moves aggressively, but someone who understands structure, who understands how documentation holds more weight than narrative. The message was short, direct, and exactly what I expected. It said everything had been received and that the initial review would begin immediately. No emotion, no speculation, just confirmation. That is how real processes communicate. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle in around me, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to look at the full picture without interruption. Not just what happened today, but everything that led to it. The small shifts, the questions, the timing that started to align too perfectly to ignore. None of it felt dramatic now. It felt structured. That is the difference between chaos and design. Chaos feels unpredictable. Design reveals itself over time. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from Melissa. Not a long one, not emotional, just a simple question asking if we could talk later. I looked at it for a moment, then placed the phone face down without responding. Not out of avoidance, but because timing matters. Conversations outside of process can complicate things that need to remain clear. Right now, clarity was the only thing that mattered. I turned back to the screen and opened the folder again, the same one I had accessed earlier, the one labeled in a way that did not draw attention. Inside it, everything remained exactly as I had left it. Organized. Complete. Not because I wanted to use it, but because I knew one day I might have to. That is what preparation is. It is not about expectation. It is about readiness. I reviewed a few key entries, not to change anything, not to add anything, just to confirm that what had been built was consistent. Consistency is what holds everything together when it is examined from the outside. A few minutes passed, then another message came in, this time not from Melissa, but from the same contact as before. A simple update. Preliminary flags had already been triggered. That was faster than most people would expect, but not surprising to me. When patterns are clear, systems move efficiently. I closed the laptop slowly and stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the city. From up here, everything looked ordered, structured, predictable. That is what systems are designed to create. Order from complexity. I rested my hands lightly against the glass and thought about something that most people misunderstand. They think the moment something is filed is the moment everything begins. It is not. It is the moment everything becomes visible. What matters most has already happened long before that. I stepped back, straightened my jacket, and prepared to move forward with the rest of the day. Meetings, calls, decisions that had nothing to do with what was unfolding, and yet everything about how I handled them would still matter. Because consistency is not selective. It is constant. As I reached for the door, I glanced once more at my phone. Another message from Melissa had come in, slightly longer this time, but I did not open it. Not yet. There would be a time for that. But not now. Right now, the process had priority. And once something reaches that level, personal timing no longer dictates the pace. The system does. And I had already positioned myself exactly where I needed to be within it. By midday, the process had already begun to show its structure, not in loud announcements or dramatic shifts, but in the quiet way systems start connecting pieces behind the surface. I sat at my desk reviewing a set of routine reports, the kind that normally required my full attention, but today they felt secondary, not because they mattered less, but because something else had moved into a higher level of priority. My phone buzzed again, and this time I picked it up, not immediately, but with the same measured pace I had maintained all morning. The message was not from Melissa. It was from the same contact handling the review, and it was different from the earlier updates. Shorter. More precise. It indicated that several entries had been flagged for deeper examination and that a request for expanded documentation had already been issued. That is how progression works in systems like this. It does not jump to conclusions. It builds layers. Each layer either supports the previous one or breaks it. I read the message once, then set the phone down, letting that information settle in. This was the point where the process moved from observation to validation. I leaned back slightly and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not because I was surprised, but because I understood what that meant for everything moving forward. When systems request more data, it is not because they are unsure. It is because they are confirming something they already see forming. My office door remained closed, the outside noise muted to a low, steady background hum, and that quiet gave space for clarity to hold its position. A few minutes later, another message came through, this time from Melissa again. Longer than before, more detailed, asking to meet, to talk, to understand what was happening. The tone had shifted. It was no longer controlled or distant. It carried something else now, something closer to urgency, but still restrained. I read it fully. This time, not reacting, not forming a reply, just absorbing the words as they were written. People reveal more in writing than they do in conversation. There is less room to adjust mid-sentence, less ability to redirect. Every word stays exactly where it is placed. I placed the phone down again without responding, not because I was ignoring her, but because I understood the importance of sequence. Responding too early would shift the balance back toward conversation, and conversation was no longer where this situation existed. It had moved beyond that. I turned back to my laptop and opened a new window, accessing the shared documentation portal that had been established earlier. The interface was simple, structured, designed for clarity, not interpretation. Files were organized by category, timestamps aligned in order, each entry linked to a specific point in time. This is what most people never see. They imagine these processes as abstract, complicated, difficult to follow. They are not. They are precise. And precision removes ambiguity. I reviewed the flagged entries one by one, not adding anything, not altering anything, just confirming that what existed matched what I had already documented privately. It did. That is the point where preparation proves its value. Not when it is created, but when it aligns with independent verification. A notification appeared on the screen, indicating that one of the entries had been cross-referenced with external data and that the alignment had been confirmed. That was the first external validation. Not a conclusion, not a final result, but a step that could not be undone. I closed that window slowly and stood up, walking once more to the window overlooking the city. The afternoon light had shifted now, casting longer shadows across the buildings, and everything outside continued with the same steady rhythm as before. Inside, the structure had advanced another level. I thought about the difference between assumption and confirmation. Assumption is internal. It can be challenged, reshaped, even dismissed. Confirmation is external. Once it exists, it does not depend on belief. It stands on its own. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not look at it right away. I let it sit there for a few seconds, then picked it up and saw another message from Melissa, shorter this time, more direct. She asked if I had already shared everything. That question carried weight. It meant she understood the scope had expanded beyond what she initially imagined. I placed the phone back down without answering. Not yet. Timing still mattered. I walked back to my desk, closed the laptop, and gathered a few documents for the next meeting on my schedule. The day was continuing, structured, consistent, unaffected on the surface, but underneath, something else was unfolding with equal precision. As I reached for the door, I paused for a moment and considered how most people misunderstand moments like this. They think the turning point is when something becomes visible, when it is spoken, when it is acknowledged. It is not. The turning point is when it becomes verifiable. And that had already happened. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and moved forward without hesitation, because at this stage, hesitation serves no purpose. The process had momentum now, and momentum, once established, does not reverse easily. It continues until it reaches its conclusion, one step at a time, exactly as it was designed to do. By the time the day began to slow down, the structure had already reached a point where nothing about it depended on perception anymore. It existed in records, in timestamps, in confirmations that no one could reinterpret once they were set. I returned to my office in the late afternoon, closed the door behind me, and sat down without rushing, letting the quiet settle in one last time. My phone was still on the desk where I had left it, and the screen showed multiple messages from Melissa, each one slightly different in tone, but all pointing toward the same thing. She wanted clarity. She wanted control back. But neither of those existed in the way she understood them anymore. I picked up the phone, scrolled through the messages slowly, not skipping, not reacting, just observing the progression. The first had been careful. The second more direct. The last one carried something closer to realization. Not panic, not desperation, just the understanding that the situation had moved beyond what she had planned. I set the phone down again and leaned back in my chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment as everything aligned in a way that no longer required interpretation. This was not about winning. It never was. It was about structure holding under pressure. About preparation proving itself when it was no longer theoretical. I opened my laptop one final time and checked the system, not expecting anything dramatic, just confirming the state of things as they stood. The update was already there. Additional entries had been verified. The review had advanced another level. Not a conclusion, not a final decision, but enough to establish direction. That is all a system needs to continue forward. Direction. I closed the laptop slowly and stood up, walking toward the window as the last light of the day stretched across the city. The reflection in the glass showed someone calm, steady, unchanged in posture, and that mattered more than anything else. Consistency is not about what happens around you. It is about how you remain within it. My phone buzzed again, and this time I knew it would be her. I picked it up, opened the message, and read it fully. It was simple. She asked what this meant for us. Not for the process, not for the outcome, but for us. That question would have mattered earlier. It would have changed something weeks ago, maybe even months ago. But now, it existed outside the structure that had already been set in motion. I typed a response, not long, not detailed, just precise enough to match everything else that had been done. I told her that this was no longer about us in the way she meant it. It was about what had been set into motion, and what could be verified moving forward. I paused for a second before sending it, not because I doubted the words, but because I understood their weight. Then I pressed send and placed the phone back on the desk. No follow-up. No explanation. Just a statement that aligned with everything that had already been established. I walked back to the desk, picked up my jacket, and prepared to leave for the day. As I reached the door, I stopped for a brief moment and looked back at the room, not with attachment, not with reflection, but with clarity. Everything that needed to happen had already happened. Everything that would happen next would follow the same structure, step by step, without deviation. I turned off the lights, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door behind me with a quiet click. The building was nearly empty now, the noise reduced to a distant hum, and as I walked toward the exit, there was no sense of urgency, no need to accelerate anything. Processes like this do not require force. They require consistency. As I stepped outside, the air had cooled, the sky dimming into evening, and the world continued forward exactly as it always does. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and paused for just a second before getting in, not to think, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge something simple. She thought she had ended something overnight. What she actually did was reveal everything that had already been in motion. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back, because in situations like this, the outcome is not decided in the moment it becomes visible. It is decided long before that, in the quiet preparation no one else ever sees.